back to its rowdy nature. We didn't know what was wrong with you last week, but you're all back. Got the Amish rocker up there singing his songs, and this is just a great day. My name's Brian. If you're new here, I'm one of the pastors, and I'm going to continue in our series called Living in Exile. Everyone has an exile story, and usually we have several exile stories. These difficult times in our life where something changes, we lose control, and we find ourselves in a scary, chaotic place where we have to relearn how to live life. And there are many people in this room right now that are in an exile season, and then the rest of us will be, if we're not in one now, there's one to come. And so the theme of exile is a major theme in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, because the nation of Israel actually had to go through a real historical exile where they were all uprooted, something changed, they lost control, and they had to find a new way to live. There's parallels to where we are today in our culture. As followers of Jesus, we find ourselves more and more in the sense of losing control of what's happening in our culture, and we find ourselves not fitting in as much. And really, people think that this is a brand new thing, but it's not at all. It's what it means to live in exile. And so we're dedicating this whole series to helping us not just survive it, but thrive these difficult seasons or even the difficulties changing around us. Today, I want to take you to my very, very favorite exile story. I think he's the hero of the exile. I think he's the best example, maybe with Esther, of exile living and doing very, very well and helping people prosper in the midst of their own loss, and that is Daniel. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn to that book. Daniel's known for some of his prophecies that took place later in his life, but today I want to focus in on his life. The first 6 chapters of Daniel record his exile story. We're given this gift, his challenges, the difficulties, the things that were taking place in his life that he had to face. And so I want to take you through his story, and I want us to be familiar with him. And I'm going to point out some connections and applications, but more than that, I just want you to know him. And I want you to have this desire maybe to study him more and to read through these chapters and read books about him, because Daniel is an incredible example for all of us of what it means to live in exile. He's one of those special people, I think, that God puts in our lives. We look at him and we say, I want to be like them. I want to be like that. I want to handle that situation the way he did or she did. Well, Daniel, because we're given his story, this intimate look at him, he can be one of those people in our lives. And so I'm going to take you through this story. I have several references up there. And then I'm going to get to one particular part of Daniel's story where he's facing a challenge that involves a dream. And what I want you to see is the reason Daniel excelled during exile is because he lived a big story. He didn't get caught up in the smaller stories, in the circumstances of his life, but he continued to live a bigger story. He lived big, you might say. And the way you illustrate this is what often basketball and football coaches say of certain athletes. You know, a lot of times you'll be on a team and someone will come by and they'll start talking to the coach and they'll say, who are the guys that or girls on your team that are really, really good? And they'll point out someone and they might say, well, they're pretty small. They're short. Or they're not big. They're pretty small. And the coach usually says if that player is a gamer, he says, yeah, they're small, but they play big. They play outside of themselves. They play big. And Daniel lived big. He played big in his life, and he's this great example. And so we're going to start in Daniel chapter 1. Many of you know the setting of this because we've been going over it over and over again during this series, but we really want you to be familiar with it. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, we're introduced to him in this idea that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And upon conquering the city, he went and he rounded up, you can see this in verse 3 and 4, talented young men and women of nobility. We're also told those that were handsome, those that had skills. They round them up and they haul them off to the Babylonian capital of Babylon, where they are to live in this pseudo-slavery and exile for really the foreseeable future. They think it's going to be the rest of their life. And Daniel is one of these, you could say slaves. He's one of these exiles that's taken away. Now, don't overlook that, because Daniel is a person. And in a span of just a few days, Daniel has this traumatizing exile experience that begins that he would have to live through for the rest of his life. Just think about the loss that he had to endure. Family, relationships, career. He lost all things that were familiar, even lost some of his dreams. And he's taken away to this other capital that's inhospitable, that's the very opposite of his home city. There's a reason that in the Bible, Babylon is compared to Jerusalem, because they are the opposites. So he's taken from this setting that's familiar and put into the opposite setting where he's now has the challenge of living out his faith. And when he gets there, he's put through this rigorous set of schooling where all of these young exiles from different nations, it wasn't just Israel, but it included all the Jewish exiles, they're put in a school where they're culturized. Their names are changed, their identities are changed, and they learn about Babylonian gods. And what they want to do is they want to get out the old and put in the new. And so Daniel gets a new name. His old name, Daniel, meant God is my judge. Now, knowing that that was his name, the Babylonians pick another name that means God, or Bel, who was the Babylonian god, is your judge. Or Bel is your God. Daniel, you need to leave the old. You need to die to that self, and you need to now live the way that you are here as a Babylonian. And so he faces all of these challenges. Now, some of us, you hear Daniel's story, and it's like, it's kind of hard to connect with some of it. And some of it's true. We haven't been hauled off to live in exile. But we do live in a world that's trying to change or define our identity all the time. There's a $1 trillion industry called marketing that appeals to our fragile identities. And it works on us every day. So Daniel faces a challenge in many ways that we face, but it's unique to him. Daniel's dedicated to his relationship with God, though. Even though he's learning about all these other gods, he's told that they're now more important. Daniel stays faithful to his God. And when some of his peers come up with a trick to catch him so that they can get him thrown into a lion's den, a real lion's den, they convince the king to pass a law that for 30 days, no one in the kingdom can pray to anyone but the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. They can't pray to their own gods or any other person. And they know that Daniel will not follow this law. And so they convince the king to do it. The king passes the law. And then you read in verse 10 that Daniel's kind of defiant. I love how defiant he is. Nothing will keep me from praying. Not busyness. Not the threat of harm to me. Not convenience. Nothing will keep me from praying. We're told that he goes to his house in the upper room where there are windows, and that's important because windows, people can see through them. And he gets down on his knees and he prays 3 times a day, as was his custom. He was a deeply spiritual person. He nurtured his relationship with God. He nurtured his prayer life, understanding that life is too important not to spend time with God. And so he did this. Daniel understood something that's important, that what we do in secret determines the soundness of who we are in public. They go together. He also understood the secret work of prayer allows us to thrive during exile. A lot of times in exile, the last thing you want to do is to stop and pray. Or a lot of times during exile, you think the last thing I want to do is make my life harder. Well, he did both right here. He was deeply devoted to God and stayed with him. And because of that, he was able to pass test after test. There was another reason that Daniel was able to pass test after test. And that is that he didn't do it alone. If you read through the first 6 chapters, you see mention of Daniel with 3 other young men over and over and over again. In chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, you see their Jewish names before their names are changed. But as friends, you would know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 3 men that were thrown into the furnace. But they're always together. We're told that they live together. One time that they're told they have to eat certain foods and they don't want to because they believe it will compromise them spiritually. And so Daniel doesn't just say, hey, I want to stay out of this. He has confidence in his friends. He says, test your servants, speaking of him and his friends. This is an important idea. During exile, you need friends who feel the pressure with you. You can't be the only one. You need the types of friends that say, I'm going to resist this. Or I'm going to pay attention to this. Or I'm going to get involved in that even when no one else will. You need friends who have the same set of values that will say, test us together. And he had these friends. In verses 17 and 18 of chapter 2, after Daniel faces another challenge where him and his friends might be killed because the king is upset about a dream, and I'm going to tell you about that in a moment, Daniel goes right to his house and asks his friends for help and support. And it goes on to say, I believe that they began to pray together. He needed the support of his friends during his own challenge. And so Daniel is incredible. And I want you to notice something about Daniel that's not mentioned here. Daniel does not have a religious job. He's not a prophet like Jeremiah or Ezekiel were prophets, although he could have been. And he's not a preacher or a priest, although he's devout enough to do so. He's not taking that job either. Daniel works as the second highest official in a corrupt pagan government. Let me say that again, because this is challenging. Daniel confronts many of our notions of what it means to be spiritual or godly in the world we live in. Daniel mastered the Babylonian culture system, political system, everything, rose to the top to second in command, and it was a plural, corrupt, evil empire, all the way to the top. The same empire that was his enemy. He works for the same king that set him into exile, that destroyed his city, that killed his friends. Daniel is serving him in this place, and he's thriving. He's doing incredibly well. We're told of Daniel as a professional that he excelled in all that he did. In chapter 1, verse 20, early on, it was noticeable to all the officials that Daniel and his friends were better than all the other magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel would serve in two different king's courts. First with Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, verse 48, he appointed Daniel to a high position. And later on, when King Darius took power, we're told that Daniel distinguished himself through his exceptional qualities. All right, let's just think about our own lives. Wouldn't it be great if our bosses noticed us, we distinguished ourselves because of our exceptional qualities? And I think the qualities include more than competence just in his job and getting things done. I have a feeling that it meant whole lot more than that. Well, Daniel is thriving. He's very successful. But here's what made Daniel special, why we're teaching him. He lived a bigger story. He lived big. He had a higher calling of success than rising to the top. In fact, he had a different definition of success. And Daniel's definition of success for living God's bigger story had to do with the thriving of other people. Daniel was one of those exiles that read the letter from Jeremiah that said, get close to the people that you're around now. Integrate with them. Be flexible enough to connect with them. Care for them, love them, pray for them. Build your life into theirs so that they might prosper, and as they do, so will you. Now, there was a prophet at the time when the exiles left Jerusalem and went to Babylon that said, you know what? You need to stay outside the city. You need to separate yourself. You don't want to pollute yourself with the way that they live or integrating together. And if you integrate and you get close, you're going to assimilate. And so they said, stay outside the city, protect yourself, and protest against it. Well, Jeremiah is the true prophet, says, no, get close, care, but don't lose yourself. Don't fully assimilate. You don't have to be flexible doesn't mean to assimilate. And so that's exactly what Daniel provides a wonderful example of. Jeremiah says, get close, close enough to care, to make a difference. Daniel does this. He's flexible to connect with different people. Now, this just isn't a Christian problem, but I think the world lacks flexibility in connecting with people different from them. Isn't that true? We have a hard time connecting with people different from us. Somehow, he's grown. He doesn't have that problem. He's connecting to people very different from him, including his enemies. It reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, a very famous passage where Paul is writing to a group of Christians who find themselves in exile. And Paul is trying to convince them that they need to be winsome and flexible in the way that they live, but they also need to remain distinct so they might help people. And Paul says stuff like this. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Then he says, to the Jews, I became like the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. To those over the law, like one over the law. To the weak, I became weak. Now, he's not being insincere. Paul's describing exile living, being flexible and close enough with people to care and to make a difference. See, it's the same message. Daniel is a perfect example of what Paul's describing in this passage that many people love to use today. He lives a bigger life than his circumstances, and that's why he's a great example to us. He worked in a government that was corrupt, yet he was incorruptible. He was asked to learn about many other religions and gods. He learned about them, but he stayed loyal to just one. He was placed into new social circles, yet nurtured his spiritual friendships. When people panicked, he stayed poised. He was forced to serve, but I love this. I read this week. He was forced to serve, but his service had the most force. He cared when no one else could. He took risks when no one else would. And he had a normal job in a terrible place where he was abused and taken advantage of over and over and over again. Now, I want to take you to a story that occurs in chapter 2 that really describes how Daniel lived a big story. And that's language we like to use here at Cornerstone. Not getting caught up in the small stories and small kingdoms and small dreams, but living the big story and being a part of a big kingdom that lasts. And in chapter 2, there is this problem. I told you earlier that the king had a dream and he was upset about the dream. The reason he was upset about the dream, I believe, is because he kind of understood it. It was a dream about a statue, a golden statue that was basically defeated by some other elements. And the king goes to his interpreters and he says, I want you to interpret this dream for me. And the interpreters say, okay, king, we're glad to do that, but tell us about the dream. And the king says, no, it's an extra test today. I want you to read my mind. You need to know what the dream is and then interpret it for me. And they say in verse 11 and 12 that this is impossible to do for humans. Only gods can do this kind of thing. And we're told that the king was angry and he ordered all the wise men, all the, it's like all the politicians in the empire to be killed. I mean, the king's a freak and he's losing it here. And Daniel and his friends are part of this. Now, Daniel has the opportunity here to step up. In verse 16, we're told that he goes to the king and he asks for time to interpret the big dream for him. Why? Because he lives beyond the small stories. He wants to help. How could he do that? Well, verse 17, we're told that in chapter 1, verse 17, we're told that Daniel had been given a gift when he got to Babylon that came from God. It's a gift that only comes from God. And that he was able to interpret dreams and visions. Here's what I want you to see. God gave an exile a gift during exile to help people in an exile issue. Do you see that? It's timely. It's not a coincidence that this man in this position has this gift. Now, let me say something about us. Every one of us has gifts. Gifts that get refined. Gifts that we get better at using during exile, and God has given us those gifts at this time in your place in life to help others. It's not a coincidence that you have the gifts that you have. It wasn't a coincidence that he had this gift. And so Daniel takes the gift. We're told that he goes home, he asks his friends for prayer, and that night the Lord reveals the mystery to him. He's faithful with his gift. God comes through and helps. He continues to carry. He's continuing to live big beyond himself. And I love in verse 28, after he interprets the dream, and I'm going to tell you about the dream in a moment, he says, he basically gives God the credit. God in heaven revealed this to me. Now remember how I told you his name was changed to reflect this other Babylonian god rather than his Jewish God, the God of the Bible? Do you think anyone, when Daniel gives God the credit, thought that he was giving credit to Bel? Or was he giving credit to Yahweh? Right? His life spoke something. He lived a bigger story. He had a bigger dream. He was building a bigger kingdom. He had a different bottom line, and I think people saw it. Well, here's the dream. In chapter 2, verse 31 and 35, I put it up there, but the dream is about how the king looked on a large statue, enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue is made of pure gold, and its chest and arms of silver, and a belly and thighs of bronze. And then it goes on to describe all these other elements. It goes on to say that this statue basically crumbles and it goes away. And as you begin to hear about the dream, you realize why Nebuchadnezzar was so upset about the dream. The statue represented him. It represented his dreams. It represented his kingdom. It represented his image that he was putting out into the world, all of his ambition. And he's having this dream, and the statue represents him, yet it comes down. And that's exactly what Daniel says when he interprets the dream. He says, "Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory." I love how he throws that in there. God allowed you to be in this position. "In your hands he has placed all mankind, the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all, and you are the head of gold." Basically saying you're the most powerful man in the world. And that was historically accurate at the time. "After you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom of bronze will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others." He basically says there'll be inferior kingdoms that overthrow yours, and they'll all keep falling. They'll rise, and then they'll fall. Same story over and over again. This would actually happen for Nebuchadnezzar in just a few years. The Persians were right at the door. They would be the next big bully in the area, and they would come in and conquer. But Daniel's interpretation to the king about his kingdom falling is not the point of the dream. We see that in verse 44. Because there's a mention of another kingdom. It says this, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold to pieces." Here's the point of the dream. Here's the message of Daniel's life. Here's the message of his story. There is a new kingdom, a better kingdom, a better dream that's coming that we can live for other than all worldly kingdoms or all personal kingdoms. It is unstoppable. It cannot be taken away from its people. It cannot be destroyed. How do we know that? Because it's not built by human armies, leadership, or ambition. It's built by God. It's talking about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God that starts small and obscure and grows. Jesus in Matthew 13 described it this way. It's like the smallest of seeds that you plant in a garden, yet the seed grows to be the largest of all the plants. It emerges. We're told of this kingdom that it'll fill the whole earth. See, Daniel's outside of the small story because he knows that there's a much bigger story that God is writing, a different kingdom with an entirely new king. And actually in chapter 9, Daniel gets some visions about this new king. He calls him the Anointed One, a title reserved for the Messiah of Israel and the Savior of the world. He has visions of Jesus. So what he's getting here is this vision that there are kingdoms that will fall, but there's only one that will last. It's the kingdom of God. Jesus is the king, and it's a much better dream to live. And what's interesting is Daniel is not after building his own kingdom, yet in the story, he's the only one that dazzles, right? He's a servant of someone else's kingdom, God's kingdom, yet he's the one that stands out and shines. Now, I want to make a connection from Nebuchadnezzar to us, which is kind of hard to do. He was a total freak. Some of us are at times, I guess, so it's not so hard. All right, Nebuchadnezzar in some regards is like us, and he's like us in this way. His kingdom for him represented his image, his identity, his personal value. He put it out there. He wanted to shine for everyone, and he held on really tightly to this idea that I am building for myself something that people will look on and say, look at how beautiful, how wonderful, how powerful. Now, here's how we're like him. We don't build statues, but we might as well. Because we build our lives and make incredible sacrifices so that the world will say to us, oh, look at how competent he is. Look at how beautiful she is. Look at how creative they are. Look at how devoted they are to God. Look at how good they are. Look at how open-minded they are. We build our own kingdom, and what we do is we put out an image of ourselves that we want everyone to look at, and we say, oh, I hope they see how much I dazzle. and we'll make incredible sacrifices. And when we feel like that image is coming down, we do the same thing Nebuchadnezzar did. We are filled with anxiety, and we're afraid. We're upset. In a sense, we're all building our own kingdoms. The Bible describes this theme over and over again. We live for ourselves. We hope that our own attempts at life will leave us fulfilled and happy, yet we're over and over again disappointed. And the reason for that is because, as Jesus said, we're building our life on sand and not a rock. When exile comes, the sand comes crashing down. See, Nebuchadnezzar is so much like us. Tim Keller says we all want to dazzle like the golden head. And we're so diligently working to say to the world, look at me, look at me, look at me. Rather than hearing the voice of the potter, remember that's another exile story that says you're beautiful, valuable, and you have purpose. So during exile, there's a work that gets done, and one of those works is that our dreams, our stories, our kingdoms that we're building, they get traded in. We lay them down, we say, oh yeah, it's not working. And we say to God, I want to live your dream for me. I want to build your kingdom. And Jesus, you're the king. You're in charge. I'm not. That would eventually happen for Nebuchadnezzar. God gave him an exile so that he would find the right king and live for the right kingdom. God does that for us. And, in a room this big, there's always people who are in a place where you need to do this work. Repentance is turning from one thing and turning back to something else. And so in this case, repentance is leaving that kingdom that you're building for yourself, the image, the beauty that you want, and you turn back to God and say, you define me, you lead me, I build your kingdom. That's work that we all have to do. In fact, that's the work that we do to enter into the kingdom, isn't it? We say to Jesus, I no longer live for myself. I'm no longer counting on myself to deal with my own struggles, but I now live for you, and I am trusting in your forgiveness to handle my sin. Your kingdom, you're the king. I want you to shine. If you're in that place, I'd encourage you to do it as we sing this last song, and the band's going to come out soon, to just offer your life to God. Yes to his kingdom. Yes to him being the king and not yourself. I'll tell you this too, if you say no today, which is fine, lots of people do, God will continue to try to get this message across. He's relentless. He does not leave us alone. And he'll come again. And lastly, I just want to ask everyone in the room if you're like Daniel. The Jews have a really neat phrase when they talk about like heroes in the scriptures. They say this phrase to their children. They say, may you be like Joseph, or may you be like Ruth. And I want to say to us, may we be like Daniel. We can all be like Daniel. And the world needs some more Daniels. In classrooms, in neighborhoods, running companies, running businesses, being teachers. Every environment in this exile world we live in, it needs more Daniels. But to be a Daniel is a daily choice. It's not like God just makes it happen in a moment. We have to choose it. I want to tell you one last story that helped me learn this when I was young. So many of you know I tell these stories all the time, but I wrestled a ton in high school and college and when I was a little kid. In fact, 20 years I spent wrestling. I got a lot to show for it nowadays. And I was a horrible loser when I was a kid, which I kind of think is a good thing. So we can talk about that later. But anyway, I was a really bad loser. And in 9th grade, though, I had to deal with this thing that was wrong with me, being a terrible loser. I was at a home wrestling duel in my home gym, and I lost. And I was really upset, and like I usually do, I kind of stormed out of the gym and was going to go to some place and just be by myself to not embarrass myself. And this elementary kid that I knew because I had helped coach this flag football team said, hey, Brian, good match, because he thought I won. But I blew it out the end, so I didn't. And I look at him, and I yelled at the kid, and I told him to leave me alone, and he started crying. And I was such a coward that I wouldn't deal with it. I just walked into the wrestling room and just, let him deal with himself, and I got to live with myself. And I was so ashamed. I thought, God, I just let winning be the bottom line. I just said yes to all the cultural pressure, the cultural guy that just says winning is the only bottom line. And I was the opposite of Daniel in that moment. And I thought, I never want to do that again. And so I made it a point to try to get better at losing. Well, this all really got tested 2 years later. So that first story is when I was a freshman. The next year, I won a state championship. The following year, my junior year, I'm wrestling in the semifinals at McNichols Arena. I have a 5-point lead with 20 seconds to go. And Bozo the Clown blows his lead. I'm still not over it. I can still smell it and see it. It's horrible. So I lost. It was the most devastating loss I ever had in any sport. And as a high school kid, your athletics are a big deal. But I had God in my life, and I had been working really, really hard to live a bigger story. And I really wanted to be a Daniel everywhere, win or lose. And I don't remember what happened after I lost. I just remember making it up to the stands and sitting with my dad. But that week, I was told what happened. I got a letter in the mail, and then I got a phone call from some people that were there in the arena. One was someone from my town. One was someone from a nearby town that just knew of me. And they both said, Brian, we saw how you lost. We know how devastating it is. It was kind of a fluke thing. You blew that lead, and you lost, and you don't get to defend your state championship. And we know that it must have been really difficult for you. But we want you to know that we were so impressed how you got up off the mat, you congratulated the other wrestler and his coach, and you walked off with dignity. And they said, we don't get to see that enough anymore. Now remember, I don't even remember what happened. So I maybe don't get the credit for it. God gets the credit. But as I read that, I thought, you know what? This is painful. I was in my sorrow that whole week for losing. But I thought, you know what? At least I lived a bigger story that day. And it actually came out during a difficult time. See, Daniels shine when things are their worst. Now, I had many other failures because I had many other wrestling matches to follow that. But that was a good day. And I was proud to say that day I lived a bigger story, and it was for God, and it spoke to people around me. And so God gives us these opportunities all the time, and we will fail. But it's always another invitation. Be like Daniel. Be as Daniel. Be as Daniel. And so I want to invite you to kind of make that commitment today. He's kind of the climax of the Exile story. He's the hero of it, and we want to be like him. And so the prayer team is going to be in the front. They're going to be in the back. And they'd be glad to pray with you. Some people think that's kind of strange, but it's not. They're just praying with you for what God would want. They're going to God with you, and they want to care for you, and they'd love to pray for you. Or maybe just even at your seat to make another commitment to God to say, you know what, I just don't want to survive, but I want to be like Daniel. And I want to be like Daniel not when things are good, but I want to be like Daniel when things are bad. And I'd encourage you to do that work with the Lord and make that commitment to him. And so, prayer team, you can come forward. You can stand together for worship, and these guys are going to lead us.